Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the 20th century's most profound and unconventional intellectual partnerships, the decades-long exchange between the analytical psychologist C.G. Jung and Nobel laureate physicist Wolfgang Pauli. And they weren't just exchanging polite letters, they were attempting to chart this fundamental, uncharted territory where quantum physics meets the collective unconscious.
An intersection, I would argue, where two titans, despite all their mutual respect, really struggle to find common ground without sacrificing the rigor of their own fields.
Indeed. And the core question that comes out of their correspondence is really this: is the conceptual borrowing of technical terms from microphysics and mathematics, concepts like acausality or symmetry, is that a valid reflection of a deep, unifying reality, what they called the Unus Mundus, the one world? I'm going to argue that this cross-disciplinary correspondence is not only valid, but actually necessary to describe that unity.
And I'll be presenting the case that borrowing such precise, technical scientific terminology risks descending into a conceptually flawed and ultimately an imprecise metaphor. It leads to confusion, I think, not clarity.
Well, I'd start from the position that the correspondence between physis, the physical world, and the psyche, the psychological world, is fundamentally structural. It's complementary, and it points toward that transpsychic reality. Jung recognized this pretty early on by coining the term psychoid. He saw the archetype, the structure underlying our psychological patterns as, and I'm quoting here, not purely psychic, but just as much physical in nature.
That recognition that the archetype might have a physical component is powerful. I'll grant you that. But I worry about the methodological leap. The moment you state that two separate domains share a structure, you absolutely must define that shared language with rigor.
But just consider the impetus for this collaboration. I mean, the seismic shift brought on by quantum mechanics. Modern physics revealed a reality that cannot be apprehended by everyday intuition. This mirrors almost exactly the non-spatial, or let's say transcendental, existence of psychological structures like the collective unconscious.
A fascinating parallel, certainly.
The common ground they were looking for wasn't in tangible objects, but in abstract ordering concepts, things like acausality, ordering, and especially symmetry. These all suggest a profound level of correspondence between the fundamental laws of nature and the fundamental structure of the psyche. This is evidence of isomorphism, a shared pattern, not mere projection.
That's a compelling case for shared abstract principles. But this is exactly where the problem of precision begins. While an abstract parallel between ordering principles might exist, the direct translation of specific technical physical terms into psychological explanations, well, it often leads to a real imprecision. Pauli himself, the physicist in this duo, found Jung's analogies technically baffling. He struggled with them throughout their entire correspondence.
Baffling, perhaps, to the conscious, ego-driven intellect that's focused on strict statistical definitions, but maybe less baffling to the depths they were trying to describe together.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The language of physics is defined by specific, reproducible, statistical laws. Pauli noted explicitly that Jung's analogies, like the sentence, "the physical analogy for this psychological state is radioactivity or the electromagnetic field," were to him simply incomprehensible.
That's a strong point, that specific quotation. But why was it incomprehensible to him?
Because Jung was equating two fundamentally different concepts: a static, wave-based phenomenon, the electromagnetic field, with a dynamic process of transmutation, which is what radioactivity is. Pauli just lamented that the crucial tertium compartius, the third comparison, the neutral bridging concept that makes an analogy logically sound, was just missing. And, historically, psychology has a habit of doing this. It describes consciousness using the fashionable science of the day, whether that was geology's layers or chemistry's compounds, or now particle physics' duality. This just risks being a delusion in our reasoning. where we're using complex jargon to feel sophisticated, not to actually clarify anything.
I agree, we have to address Pauli's technical concerns, of course, but we can't ignore the necessity of creating a neutral language, one that transcends the purely mental or the purely material. When Jung used a term like radioactivity in a psychological context, he wasn't trying to, publish a paper in a physics journal. He was exploring the necessity of a language that emerges spontaneously from the unconscious itself.
But that spontaneity is precisely the issue of rigor. I mean, when we borrow terms that are defined by objective reproducibility and statistical laws, we must respect their physical meaning. Radioactivity, rigorously defined, involves the measurable transmutation of a chemical element and the emission of active rays. So when Jung applies this to a psychic state, the term just functions as this highly charged, dreamlike image of the imagination. It sacrifices its precise, measurable physical meaning. It stops being a scientific concept and becomes solely a complex symbol. Why muddy the waters like that?
I guess I just come at it from a different way. We're not arguing for methodological parity here. We're arguing for a conceptual isomorphism that's rooted in experience. Look at the actual data they were working with. Pauli's own dreams, which Jung analyzed. Pauli himself acknowledged that his unconscious spontaneously produced terms like active nucleus or radioactivity in his dreams. And he interpreted that as a spontaneously active center undergoing a transmutation that was linked to archetypal contents approaching his consciousness.
That is a compelling argument using Pauli's own internal experience. The spontaneous emergence of a term in a dream certainly confirms its potent symbolic power, the unconscious finding the most dramatic image for transformation. But that is completely distinct from a conscious scholar applying technical physical definitions rigorously. I mean, Pauli's lifelong struggle was trying to retroactively fit Jung's symbolic usage into a meaningful, coherent physical context, and he often found that logical bridge was missing.
But if this symbolism holds a transsubjective meaning that's accessible to both fields, a physicist and a psychologist both recognizing the term as describing a central active transformation, doesn't that suggest it's drawing from a neutral level something deeper than just personal fantasy? If the unconscious uses physics to describe the process of individuation, that suggests the fundamental patterns of nature are reflected in the psychic drive for order.
Okay, let's talk about that search for order, specifically symmetry. For Pauli, this was not just an intellectual concept, it was a deeply felt aesthetic and philosophical commitment.
Absolutely. The search for symmetry and unifying laws directly reflects the psyche's drive toward wholeness, or the self. Pauli's lifelong quest for a unified field theory and his deep commitment to symmetry they're powerful examples of the archetypal structure of matter influencing scientific inquiry. He believed the beauty of simplicity and inevitability that's sought in physics was essentially the archetypal structure of matter manifesting itself. It's the soul's reflection cast onto the physical world.
I agree that the psychological drive for wholeness is projected onto the laws of nature. But the problem with relying on the archetype of perfect symmetry is that in the objective world, that archetype failed. It failed spectacularly and dramatically. We can't ignore the mid-century upheaval Pauli himself lived through, the so-called Chinese Revolution in physics.
You're referring to the experimental disproving of the conservation of parity?
Exactly. Parity, or mirror symmetry, had been held as a fundamental law that nature couldn't tell left from right. When experiments showed that the weak interactive force violated this left-right symmetry, Pauli was just utterly devastated. He was, to use his own words, betrayed in his love of symmetry. This empirical failure of what was considered an aesthetic necessity suggests that the archetype of symmetry or wholeness is a desired and potentially misleading human construct, not a guaranteed natural law governing all of reality.
But isn't focusing on the failure of one specific type of symmetry a bit too narrow? That failure, that shock, it simply shows the dynamism of the archetype, not its dissolution. The point is not the preservation of perfect symmetry in that one specific manifestation, but the persistence of the drive toward ordering principles.
How can you say the archetype persists when its physical manifestation failed?
Because physicists immediately sought a deeper, compensating structure. They found that while parity failed, the combination of CPT invariance holds true under more general assumptions.
Could you just clarify that for our listeners?
CPT stands for charge, parity, and time. The discovery was that if you flip all three properties at the same time, reverse the charge, reverse the spatial orientation, and run time backward, the laws of physics are still symmetric. So the failure of parity simply pushed the archetypal need for order to a deeper, more abstract level. It demonstrates the archetype's persistence in shaping how scientists approach ultimate reality. The archetype adapts. It doesn't just vanish.
That shows the persistence of the scientific method seeking a greater law, yes. But let's turn to what I think is the most critical conceptual gap: the role of the observer, acausality, and meaning. I would assert that the statistical character of microphysics laws is the price you pay for reproducibility, which makes those laws independent of the psychic state of the observer.
I see the distinction you're drawing.
Physics allows for acausal observation, that an atom decays at some unknowable moment, but it has no use for the concept of meaning. This, for me, fundamentally separates physical acausality, which is pure randomness, from psychological synchronicity, which is defined as a meaningful coincidence. You cannot conflate these two just because they both reject old deterministic causality. Physical laws remain reproducible at the statistical level, regardless of the observer's intent or emotional investment. The universe just doesn't care if a decaying atom happens to correlate with someone's psychic breakthrough.
That's a compelling distinction, though I would frame it differently, relying on Niels Bohr's concept of complementarity. In physics, the phenomenon observed must include the specifics of the whole experimental setup. The observer's choice of measurement actually determines what aspect of reality is manifested. The observer is never truly eliminated, only statistically diluted.
But psychically independent, I would insist.
By analogy, then, the non-physical archetypes are complementary to the physical realm. They're the invisible reflector that produces reflections or multiple manifestations in both the mind and the material world. The archetype is fundamentally transpsychic. It precedes consciousness. Therefore, the psychological observer, through consciousness, creates the context where physis and psyche become, well, indivisibly linked.
But this indivisibility requires the addition of meaning. The physical acausality of quantum mechanics is seen by a physicist as just a very weak generalization of the old causality. To leap from that quantum randomness to some psychic ordering factor that's responsible for a meaningful coincidence, that is a tremendous conceptual stretch. It confuses the methodological limits of observing microphysics with the spiritual intention that's inherent in the self.
That stretch, that leap, is the very definition of the Unus Mundus and the whole necessity of this dialogue. The astonishing conformity of physical and psychological thought processes, the fact that the physicist is shocked by the loss of symmetry at the same time the psychologist is cataloging the archetype of order, that suggests the same pattern is driving both scientific inquiry and the search for meaningful coincidences.
I agree that the search for unity is profound and the impulse to see shared patterns is powerful. But as scholars, we have to exercise intellectual charity and precision. My concern remains that while this dialogue began as a collaboration seeking synthesis, the tendency for the unconscious to relieve the burden of psychology by pushing difficult psychic contents into the seemingly objective realms of physics or biology, it just highlights the continuous need for us to reevaluate these disciplinary boundaries and to do so critically.
And that is precisely why this debate, begun by Jung and Pauli, remains an urgent necessity for modern thought. The material we've looked at today doesn't declare a victor in this terminological struggle. Instead, it reveals the inseparable nature of the objective world and the deep structures of the human mind seeking to comprehend it.
And we leave the listeners to weigh whether the goal of a unified vision, that Unus Mundus, justifies the terminological liberties taken along the way to build that bridge between science and symbolic reality.